Okay, so you should be able to see my screen. Okay, so to begin, a European framework for defining youth homelessness. That is our conversation topic for this morning's webinar. Over the course of this webinar, I'm going to talk you through a little bit about why we chose to create a framework for defining youth homelessness and what are the main elements of this framework. Any of you who are watching this should be able to access it if you go over to the Fianza website, or if you Google European Framework for Defining Youth Homelessness, you will be able to access the document. So first of all, some quick reasons as to why this was a really important part of work for us. The first is our policy work on youth homelessness has grown enormously. Over the last 4 or 5 years, we have seen more of our members, because ultimately Fianza is a membership organization, more of our members are being confronted with the reality of youth homelessness. And what we also know is that youth homelessness differs to adult homelessness in many different ways. And so it needed a different approach. And so the focus hasn't just been on, homelessness in general, but specifically, how do we develop services that address the needs of young people? That's something that we have noticed within our network, and that kind of comes from two different areas. The first is our Fianza Youth Network. Fianza Youth is a network of professionals working on youth homelessness. It has grown quite organically over the last, I think, 5 to 6 years. Each year we host a 5-day study session with the Council of Europe. It's a 5-day course on a topic related to youth homelessness, where we bring 40 different professionals, researchers, policymakers at city level, national level, people from think tanks, housing agencies, associations, and obviously homeless services, together to talk about youth homelessness. And within the Fianza Youth Network, the more that we talked about youth homelessness, the more we realized actually we all have very different definitions of youth homelessness. Some countries have no definition whatsoever. And then homelessness as one entity, but also youth and young people, they differ quite considerably across Europe. And from that work, we identified that if we really want to push solutions and push, a European-wide approach to combating youth homelessness, well, then we needed to have some sort of a definition for that. When one person in Ireland is talking about youth homelessness, somebody in Poland can also understand it, and they're talking about the same issue. The third element, of course, and many of you will probably know this from your own organizations and services, but youth homelessness has risen enormously over the last 6 to 7 years. It's really a legacy issue of austerity. We have seen increases in some countries of youth homelessness by 80 to 100% increases. Other countries, the data isn't always so clear, but where we have the data, we estimate that roughly 30% of all people experiencing homelessness are under the age of 30. And the issues that we face, or that we are confronted with, is that youth homelessness is a hidden form of homelessness. Young people, we know this from research, we know this from independent think tanks, that young people are less likely to engage with mainstream services. They're more likely to self-assert, and if they do engage with services, they're more likely to dip in and out. And that makes it a more difficult target group to work with. And so what this framework does is it shines a light on youth homelessness. It's intended to be a document that can be used by services, but also by policymakers to understand what are the needs of young people who are experiencing homelessness. And from there, how do we design services? How do we design policies that can ultimately prevent young people from entering homelessness in the first instance, but that we can also push the boundaries of our services, that they can become more inclusive to young people, so that we can get young people out of them quicker and ultimately end youth homelessness in Europe. And so what we want to, pitch this as is a harmonized approach. Here is the definition. You can read it on the slides. It's also obviously in the framework document, which I encourage you all to download from our website. I think there are two elements to this definition that crop up most often when we show it to people. And as part of this work, of course, we did surveys with our membership, we did focus groups, we did some consultations. And the two things that often stuck out was the first was the without a parent, family member, or other legal guardian. And the reason for that stipulation is that here we are talking about young people who are independent. So if you were somebody who is 15, 16, 17, 18, and you present to homeless services with your mother or with your father or your parents or another legal guardian, that is what we are calling a form of family homelessness. We're calling that household homelessness, but it doesn't fit in with what we're talking about here, which is youth homelessness. And here we are really focusing on young people that are presenting themselves independently of a legal guardian. And the second element, which can be quite contentious, is the age range, 13 to 26. The difficulty with the age range is for many homeless services, there is a distinction in legislation between child homelessness and adult homelessness. In that child homelessness, and I use inverted commas here, child homelessness should never exist. It should never exist because once you are under the age of 18, if you are at risk of becoming homeless, you should be supported by some form of child services. You shouldn't be in the homeless sector whatsoever. But yet, when we went and we spoke to our members and we did surveys, we did focus groups, we kept asking, what is the youngest age that you have worked with young people? And across Europe, 13 kept coming up over and over and over again as the youngest age that they were working with young people presenting to services. This would also tally with international research, particularly from Canada, which found that amongst people that they interviewed in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, when they asked them, what was the first age that you ever became homeless? 12 was the most frequent answer, or was the youngest most frequent answer. And so I think that's a very important element to build into our definition. It's not to say that all homeless services should be working with 13-year-olds, but it's to say that people as young as 13, they do become homeless on their own. And it is not really sufficient for governments and for national policies and strategies to say it doesn't exist, because it does exist. We've seen it in our members, we see it borne out in research, and if you talk to frontline workers, they will tell you that that is real. And so that's why we made the decision to bring the definition down to 13, so that all young people who are at risk of becoming homeless or are experiencing homelessness can be given a youth-orientated solution. The upper threshold is 26. Again, that tallies with already what's in most research and what our members are typically working with. Usually the cutoff point for a youth service could be 24, 25, 26. We do take a note in the framework, though, that 26 can also be a transitionary period. So that if you feel as a service provider that the people that you're working with, they turn 26, but they still need access to the service, it shouldn't be an automatic cutoff either. You should either prepare people for that change or allow them to continue accessing that service to their 27, 28. And those things I think are quite important. The other element I would add to the age range, when we particularly looking at the lower threshold, is that many distinctions are made between 17 and 18. And for very valid reasons in most cases. 18, you can vote, you are entitled to different access to services, different benefits, but you're also treated as an adult by the justice system and by other agencies of the state. But from a psychological perspective, when you look at the research, it continuously and consistently shows us that young people are not fully psychologically, cognitively developed until the ages of 23, sometimes 24. And I think that's also important, so that while in law that there is a distinction between a 17 and an 18-year-old, when it comes to their needs, when it comes to the actual services that they require, 17, 18, it almost becomes quite an arbitrary age, that just because you turn 18 doesn't suddenly mean you don't need access to all these services. And so that's why we've gone for this 13 to 26. I think what's also really important about this particular framework is it's not, we've gone for the terminology, a European framework for defining youth homelessness, rather than a very strict definition of youth homelessness, because Europe varies enormously. And it's not to say that what we say here is the be all and end all and it's rigid, but it should be a conversation starter. It should be a document that you can review internally as a service and say, okay, here is what Fianza says are some of the main components of the experience of youth homelessness. Can we address these needs? These are what research typically tells us. Here's what service providers across Europe have said. Are we actually able to address these needs? So it's an adaptable framework. And when you go through the document, and again, I encourage you to download it, you'll find that we go through the diversity of experience. And so the diversity of experience looks at what are the different elements, because there's almost a small contradiction in what I'm saying, in that we say young people is a distinct form of homelessness. We want it to be treated separately from adult homelessness. But at the same time, what I'm also saying is that those young people, they're not a homogenous group. They have very different needs. And so a one-size-fits-all approach for all young people won't work either. You have to be able to tailor the service to the different needs. And so, for example, if you look at age, the difference between a 13-year-old, an 18-year-old, and a 26-year-old are all very different. And service providers will need to be able to address those different needs. Young people leaving state care, they'll again have a very different set of needs and different set of services that should be made available to them in advance of them becoming homeless or while they're homeless. Again, gender, we know from research that up to 70, again it changes, but usually 70% plus of women experiencing homelessness have experienced some form of violence either before they became homeless or while they became homeless. That brings a certain form of trauma that services have to be able to address. Just because you're dealing with a young person doesn't mean that you forget about these other experiences that they have had. Again, for LGBTIQ youth, there's a whole issue there around family rejection, losing touch with your family, how LGBTIQ youth access services, whether services are LGBTIQ inclusive, are they built in such a way that feels homophobic or transphobic, that is actually able to address the needs that come from someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. Drug use, again, if you look at the research, it shows you that young people use drugs in a different way to the adult population. Often it comes as part of losing touch with your family, your support network. The peers that you replace your family support network can often be involved in antisocial or criminal behavior. And so the drug use isn't simply a form of addiction, but there's also another parallel going on there with the community that you're working with to replace your family. Again, we know mental health is another big issue. Housing supply and discrimination is a very specific issue, I think, that comes up in the area of youth homelessness. Because if you look at young people in general, we find often there are what we call direct and indirect forms of discrimination. Direct discrimination is where a landlord, for example, says no students, no young professionals, nobody under the age of 30. Point blank, they won't take them. Indirect discrimination comes where landlords don't put in those explicit stipulations, but they will say we need 2 months deposit, we need 3 landlord references, and they put in we need a permanent contract, or you must have been in stable employment for at least 2 years. Excuse me. These are all different stipulations that go into accessing tenancy that actually I would say disproportionately discriminates against younger people. So what happens there is the most vulnerable people, the most marginalized, who don't have a family, traditional family set up to support them, they can't take that housing. And what they may end up doing is taking housing that is incredibly poor quality, that can be hazardous for their health, where they may not even have a tenancy right, they might not even have a lease to stay in that house, which puts them in a very precarious position of housing exclusion and really puts them at an enormous risk of becoming homeless. Or they can't even access that form of housing and they end up becoming homeless. Sex work is also another issue that we need to, I think, have a broader conversation of in the whole area of homelessness in general. I will say that Fianza doesn't have a formal position on sex work. There are some organizations in the sector who don't engage in the topic of sex work, they don't work on it. There are others who do. I think from our own perspective, when we were designing this framework, it's something that comes up. more so impacts on young women experiencing homelessness, and I would say young trans people experiencing homelessness in this context. But it's important to look at because it is a reality that many people experiencing homelessness turn to because they don't feel the services are adequately equipped to deal with their needs, and it is a reality. And so denying that it happens isn't going to support that person. And so it's not to say what you should or you shouldn't be doing, but I think it's becoming aware that sex work happens and that general prohibitions and saying that anybody who engages in sex work cannot access our service, which does happen sometimes in the sector, that is to deny an experience that they have. And are you therefore further marginalizing and further excluding a young person who's already quite marginalized, experiencing homelessness? And the last is family conflict. Again, this is something more so that affects young people in terms of, I think a lot of the research bears out that young people have either themselves been victims of some form of domestic violence, abuse by a parent or a legal guardian, or they've witnessed it. And again, come back to what I said earlier, that brings a certain form of trauma. I think when we look at categorizing youth homelessness, then we very much follow the ethos definition. For those of you who don't know, ethos is the European typology of homelessness and housing exclusion. It defines homelessness across various different domains, but you have your physical, your social, and your legal domain. If you go to the Fianso website, you can also download Ethos, Ethos Lite, excellent resources. But we follow the same category. We look that youth homelessness occurs where young people can be roofless, they can be sleeping on the street, houseless, where they might be in emergency accommodation, they might be in squats, they might be in B&Bs. But then you have insecure and inadequate housing. And here is where you have probably the largest group of young people. And we know it again because young people are more likely to engage in sofa surfing. They're more likely to engage in those, in those services or in those strategies that mask their homelessness. And again, that comes down to many different issues. Another thing that came up in a lot of our research that we identified was young people themselves typically don't identify as being homeless. They see themselves as sofa surfing, yes, but if you ask them, are they homeless, they wouldn't necessarily say they were, and therefore they would be less likely to turn to homeless services. And that's a very interesting dynamic if you want to reach out to this hidden population. And the last thing I would add in terms of the components that we built into this European framework is homelessness in general. This isn't just specific to youth homelessness, but it's important in this conversation. Homelessness is a human rights issue. You can't separate the two. Homelessness at its core is a huge infringement of your basic human rights. It's a huge violation of your human rights. And that I think it's very important that that is particularly not just for service providers, but I would say more so for policy development, that when we talk about youth homelessness, it is not saying about young people themselves has failed as an individual, which can sometimes be the narrative that we create about young people, but rather it should be the system has failed. Somebody is homeless because not just of one single occurrence, but a series of their economic and their social rights have been infringed. Homelessness is the result of an infringement to your right to housing, your right to healthcare, your right to education, your right to employment, your right to an adequate standard of living. So when you go through the framework, we list out different European and international conventions, and I think they're an important resource for the conversation. That we don't just deal with homelessness as like as a thing that we an abstract thing that we're doing, but it fits into a human rights context of how we approach this problem. And it's also important because it allows us to look at the interdependent nature of rights. I don't want to get too legalistic here on this webinar this morning because it's not the purpose, but human rights are ultimately interdependent. And that also talks about how services should be designed. That you can't, if you just give somebody an apartment, they might be housed, but their likelihood is that they may fall back into a situation of homelessness later because there are other rights. As I mentioned earlier, healthcare, adequate standard of living, employment, education, etc. And so building services that take that human rights approach, can be truly holistic is really, really important. And we flesh that out a little bit more in the framework document. I think I should say that the whole purpose of this document was really a starting point. It is something that our membership, our services, think tanks, foundations, agencies, governments can take to look at and think about, how does this tally with how we define homelessness in Europe, or how do we specifically define youth homelessness? And I know that many people will say, okay, well, what is the purpose of that document? It can be quite theoretical, but I think it is really important to have those conversations. If you want proper strategies and policies in place that can combat youth homelessness, you need to have a youth-orientated solution, and that means you need to have a definition for youth homelessness. But I would also say is that this is still the first document. It's the first step in this whole area of helping us define youth homelessness. So we want obviously to move beyond theoretical definitions, that this isn't just a case of, here's the framework, we dust our hands, we leave it up in the bookshelves and people print it off and look over it. We want this to be a living document, something that we change and that we update. And already we have plans to update the existing document to include a greater focus on migration for young people experiencing homelessness. But the other element is we want to create a compendium, a set of practices that promote youth-orientated solutions. And so within this document, we have the whole section on diversity of experiences. What we are looking for in Fianza from people listening today, if you know of other services, is to be able to say, here's our framework of what we define youth homelessness as. And in another document, here are different practices that you can implement, that you can develop and deliver, that can meet the needs that we have identified in this framework. And so if you know of any services, of any practices that are designed for young people that tally with any of the diversities of experience that we've worked with, whether it's young women, young people leaving state care, family conflict, mental health, any of those issues, we would genuinely love to hear from you. So my email address is in the slide. Please feel free to get in touch if you have some practices you'd like to include. This is a piece of work that we'll be working on over the coming months to be published towards the end of the year. But for now, if you have a service, if you have something you would like to include, we would really like to hear from you. That's it for me and the presentation for the moment. I'm just going to take my screen off share. If anybody has a question that they want to ask, there's a questions box down below on the right-hand part of your screen. I'm just going to reset my, perfect. Just reset my camera. So if you have any questions, feel free to throw them into the questions box and I can come back and answer them. I know some people were a little bit late joining the call in the beginning. So just as a quick recap, this is one of our weekly webinars. So in Fianza, we are running 2 sets of webinars. We do them every Wednesday now. So if you are interested in doing a half an hour, 20-minute, 30-minute presentation next Wednesday or in the Wednesdays that come, feel free to drop me an email with a description of what you'd like to present. We'd be really happy to have you on board. Next week's weekly webinar, the Breakfast Bites, will be from Sharon Gurr from the Rock Trust, and it will be looking at self-care. So how do we, as frontline workers, as social workers working with people experiencing homelessness, how do we practice self-care and the importance that that has for being able to do your job more effectively, to be non-judgmental, to be objective, etc. And then we also have a series of monthly webinars which are more specifically focused on youth homelessness. At the end of this month, we'll have one on how do you finance youth housing solutions. And at the end of May, we'll have one on LGBTIQ youth homelessness. And for both the weekly webinars and the monthly webinars that are more focused on youth, we will have we will have all that information sent in the email. Just one second, we have a question. So a question comes in, is there research out there about the mobility of youth homelessness? We have the idea that young people travel more in between cities. not research that I can think of off the top of my head, but I know when we, because within Fianza I'm responsible for youth homelessness, I'm also responsible for LGBTIQ homelessness. And on the LGBTIQ element, particularly with the youth dimension there, we know that there's a higher proportion of people who travel between cities. And that is generally between young people who come out to their family as gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex. They get rejected by the family. Either they get formally evicted, the family kick them out, or the family just creates such a toxic environment that they don't want to live there anymore, and they then leave and they move to another city. Other examples are LGBTIQ youth who live in more rural communities, and they go to the city because they think the city might be more inclusive, there might be more opportunities for them, and they get there, and obviously those services and opportunities aren't so easy to access. But I can't think of a study for general youth homelessness off the top of my head. I'll have a look around my office and I'll ask to see if anyone else knows of any. If anybody does have any research from their own context, please send me an email, or you can drop it in here and I can include it in the webinar notes afterwards. But I think from a what we hear from social workers, I think this does happen quite a lot. I'm just not sure there's a huge study on it. And obviously there's a huge element as well. I'm not sure if this is what you meant also in terms of mobility, but within Europe it's a huge issue as well, is EU mobile citizens that my colleague Mauro works on, of people experiencing homelessness who might be Danish, but they're living in the UK, for example. But I think maybe you meant more within countries. If there are no other questions, then I'm going to close the webinar. We will have a recording of this up on our website by the end of today. You should get an email with this recording and the links to the PowerPoint and the upcoming webinar registration links over the course of next week and the following months as part of the notes. Okay, with that, I'm going to close the webinar. I hope everyone has a lovely day and hope to see you all soon. Bye.